The night was thick with fog, heavy enough to weigh down the air, as if the city itself had become suffocated by the darkness. Muffled sounds of distant traffic and the faint echoes of hurried footsteps on the wet pavement seemed swallowed by the thick, misty blanket. Mary, an elderly black woman, made her way slowly down the familiar street. Her hands gripped the handle of her worn leather purse, but there was no fear in her gait. She had walked these streets for decades, her life a mosaic of both hardship and triumph. Each step was a silent declaration of her strength, even though her body now moved with the hesitance of age. The world had changed in some ways, but not enough. It was still a place where she, a black woman, was regarded with suspicion, disdain. That truth stung every time she stepped into public. But tonight, there was something more. She could feel it in the way the fog clung to her skin, heavy with unspoken threats. As she turned the corner, her eyes briefly caught the glint of flashing lights, the familiar red and blue of a police cruiser parked at the edge of the street. The door to the vehicle opened, and out stepped Officer Roberts, a man whose face she had seen countless times in this neighborhood, a man whose gaze she had never forgotten, one that radiated the silent hate she had come to expect from those who had been trained to protect, but were never really trained to see her. Behind him, a K-9 unit stood, its leash taut, muscles coiled like a spring. The German Shepherd growled softly as it eyed Mary. She froze for just a moment before taking a steady breath. No, she would not be intimidated. Not now. Not ever. Where do you think you're going, old woman? Officer Roberts barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the mist. You lost, or just wandering around where you don't belong? Mary's eyes, deep with the wisdom of years lived, met his with calm defiance. I'm going home. That's none of your business, the officer sneered, taking a step closer. His K-9 growled louder now, sensing its handler's aggression, but it was still under control, for now. You don't belong here, woman. Not in this neighborhood. You better turn around and get out of my sight before things get ugly. The words struck harder than any blow. They weren't just insults, they were reminders of a history, of a country where she was still seen as inferior. But she wasn't afraid. She had lived through worse. This was just another battle in a war that had lasted her whole life. Your ugly words won't scare me, Mary said, her voice unwavering. Officer Roberts raised his hand, ready to give the command. The K-9 was straining against the leash, eager to bite. Mary stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locked on the officer. She wasn't backing down. In that moment, the unexpected happened. The K-9, as if it had its own mind, jerked violently on the leash. Instead of lunging at Mary, the dog turned its head toward its handler and snapped its jaws, growling in anger. Officer Roberts tried to pull back, but the dog was relentless. It was as if it had forgotten its training, as if it had chosen its own side. With a powerful jerk, the dog broke free, lunging at the officer, knocking him to the ground. Get off me, you damn mutt, Roberts shouted, scrambling to his feet, but the dog wouldn't stop. Its teeth bared, its body taut with the anger of something unchained, untamed. Mary stood frozen for a moment, watching in disbelief. Then, without a word, she began to walk away. The dog, now fully detached from its handler, watched her, eyes full of something she couldn't quite describe, maybe understanding, maybe respect. It didn't follow her, but it didn't attack either. The officer, now humiliated and enraged, grabbed the leash with trembling hands and yanked the dog back. Come on, you worthless animal, he shouted as the dog slowly trotted to his side, still glaring at Mary. Mary's steps quickened, but she didn't look back. As the officer cursed behind her, she knew something had shifted, something that had nothing to do with the officer or the dog, but everything to do with her. Tonight, she had won a small battle in the ongoing war of survival, a battle that would never be forgotten. The next morning was clouded with the remnants of last night's fog, the city still holding onto the chill. Mary woke early, as she always did, before the sun could rise fully. Her small apartment, tucked away in a quiet corner of the neighborhood, smelled faintly of old wood and lavender, a scent that had comforted her for years. She sat by her window, looking out over the streets below, her eyes tracing the outlines of the buildings, the trees, and the faces that passed by. Some she knew, others, strangers. She had always been aware of how people looked at her. The world, in its silent way, was constantly reminding her that she didn't belong in certain places. She had experienced that feeling since she was a child, walking with her mother through the white neighborhoods, feeling the stares, the whispers behind her back. But now, as an old woman, those stares had changed. They were more calculating, more dangerous. As she sipped her coffee, Mary thought about the previous night. Officer Roberts, the dog, The way the animal had resisted its own master, it was a rare thing to witness. It made her wonder about the deeper currents of resistance in the world, the ways in which even those trained to oppress could be turned. The thought lingered in her mind, both strange and powerful. The neighborhood outside was waking up. Children ran down the sidewalk, backpacks bouncing as they raced to school. The newsstands were busy, selling papers filled with the same headlines: violence, protests, political scandals. It never changed. Life went on, but the world outside stayed the same, hostile, indifferent. As Mary gathered her things and prepared to leave, she felt a familiar weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just the weariness of age, it was the weight of history, the scars of a lifetime of injustice. She'd lived through the marches, the struggles for civil rights, the assassinations of leaders who had once seemed invincible. Her own life had been a testament to survival, but sometimes she wondered how much longer she could endure the weight of everything that had come before her. The world may have changed in some ways, but it hadn't changed enough. Stepping out into the street, she adjusted her shawl and made her way down the block. The street seemed quieter today, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. She kept her eyes forward, not letting anyone see the anger that flickered inside her. There were still things to be done, and she wasn't done yet. She walked past the corner store, where a young man stood outside, leaning against the brick wall. He looked up as she approached, his eyes quickly darting away. He knew better than to make eye contact with her, as many did. Mary had never been one to back down from anything, and that was something the young people of this neighborhood had learned long ago. She wasn't just any old woman. She was a reminder of the past, of everything that had been fought for and lost, of everything that still needed to be won. As she walked further down the block, she saw the familiar face of Mr. Johnson, the elderly black man who ran the corner shop. He gave her a smile, nodding as they crossed paths. "Good morning, Miss Mary," he said with warmth in his voice. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she replied, her voice steady, though there was a sadness in her eyes. They both knew the world was not what it should be, but it was all they had. The sun was starting to break through the clouds now, casting a golden light across the street. Mary walked on, lost in her thoughts, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. And then, she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her, hurried and quick. She turned just in time to see Officer Roberts again, his face twisted with anger, his hand outstretched, his voice calling to her. "You," he spat, his words sharp like knives. "You think you're special? You think you can just walk around here, acting like you own the place?" Mary stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had faced this before, too many times. His words were just another attempt to diminish her, to make her feel less than human, but she wasn't going to let him win. "I don't need your permission to walk here, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And you won't stop me, not now, not ever." The officer took a step closer, his eyes burning with rage. The dog, now on a leash, was at his side, growling low. But Mary wasn't afraid. She'd lived through worse. She had seen the worst of humanity and survived it. Officer Roberts, for all his anger, was just another face in a long line of people who thought they could control her. As the officer opened his mouth to shout again, Mary turned on her heel and walked away. Her steps were slow but steady, her back straight, her head held high. She knew that one day, all of this would change, but for now, she was still here, and she was not going anywhere. Let's take a small pause. Please write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had any similar experiences in your life? Something you can relate to? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new chapters. Now, let's continue. The sun had set, leaving behind a sky tinged with orange and purple. The streets of the neighborhood had quieted down, the usual hum of activity replaced by the softer sounds of distant voices and the rustling of trees in the evening breeze. Mary sat on her porch, the chair creaking beneath her weight as she rocked back and forth slowly. The evening air was cool against her skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over her. The day had been long, full of errands and visits to friends, the usual routine that helped her stay grounded, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the incident with Officer Roberts and the dog. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something more than just a random encounter. The dog's strange defiance, the way it had turned on its master, it felt like a sign, like the world was trying to tell her something. But what? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mary stood up slowly, her old bones creaking as she made her way inside to answer it. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she knew better than to be surprised. People came and went in this neighborhood, And sometimes, they brought news, good or bad. When she opened the door, she was met by a familiar face. It was Daniel, a young man who lived a few houses down. He was the son of one of Mary's old friends, and though he had grown up and moved away for a while, he had recently come back to the neighborhood. "Good evening, Miss Mary," Daniel said with a smile, his eyes bright but carrying a certain weight. "Evening, Daniel. What brings you here?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. "I wanted to check in on you, see if you were okay after what happened yesterday," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was watching. "I saw everything from down the street. You know, the way the officer—" "Yes, I saw it too," Mary interrupted, not wanting to rehash the details. She motioned for him to sit down on the porch with her. "Come, have a seat. You're right, though, it wasn't just a regular encounter. There's something strange about it." "Daniel," he nodded, sitting down beside her. "I agree. I've never seen anything like that before. That dog, it was like it knew something. Or maybe it was just fed up with all the nonsense." Mary smiled faintly. "Maybe it's a little of both. But you know, Daniel, this isn't just about the dog. It's bigger than that. The officer's anger, his need to control, it's a reminder of everything that's been happening for years, decades even." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I know, things are different, but not really. Some people think things are better, but I don't know, Miss Mary. It feels like the same old fight, just with new faces." "That's because it is," Mary said, her voice growing more serious. "The faces change, the tactics change, but the struggle remains the same. They want to control us, keep us in our place, and they'll use whatever means they can to do it, whether it's fear, anger, or the law. But we can't let them win. We never have." There was a long silence between them. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, things that neither of them wanted to say aloud, but both understood all too well. Mary had lived through so much, through years of marches, protests, and the constant battle for her humanity. She had seen so many people, especially the younger generation, grow up with a sense of optimism that things would change, that the world would be a better place. But Mary knew better. She had seen the cycle repeat too many times to believe in easy fixes. "Miss Mary, I don't know how you do it," Daniel said softly, his voice tinged with admiration. "You've seen everything, and yet you still keep going, still keep fighting." Mary looked at him, her gaze steady. "Because I have no choice. We have no choice. If we stop fighting, they win, and I won't let them win. Not now, not ever." Daniel nodded, understanding more than he had before. He stood up, giving her a respectful nod. "I'll let you get some rest, but just know that I'm here if you need anything. And I'll be more careful, too, about the things I say, the things I do." Mary watched him walk away, the weight of his words lingering in the air. It was always the young ones who felt the weight of the world the hardest. They were the ones who saw the injustices and wanted to change them, to make a difference. But Mary knew it wasn't easy. The world wasn't ready for the kind of change that people like Daniel wanted, but it had to come, sooner or later. She just hoped she would live to see it. As the evening stretched on, Mary sat back down in her chair, the creaking of the wood beneath her a familiar sound. The world outside was darkening, but she wasn't afraid, not anymore. She had lived through too many dark nights to be scared of the shadows. The fight was far from over. It had never really ended, and Mary wasn't about to stop now. The morning after Daniel's visit, the world seemed quieter. The streets were still, the usual hum of city life muffled by a sense of foreboding. Mary could feel it deep in her bones, a heavy weight that pressed down on her chest as she stood at the edge of her porch, staring into the distance. She had lived through many moments of uncertainty, but this felt different. It wasn't just the incident with the officer or the strange behavior of the dog. It was the way people were starting to look at her, as if they were waiting for something to change, something to happen. Mary wasn't one to give in to fear easily, but the silence that hung in the air, the unspoken tension between neighbors, was beginning to wear on her. It reminded her of the old days, of the times when protests were met with brutal force, when voices were silenced by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. She took a deep breath and walked inside, her feet making soft thuds against the floor. The house was dim, the curtains drawn tight to keep out the harsh sunlight. Mary didn't need the light to see clearly. She had lived in the shadows long enough to know where the danger lay. It wasn't long before there was another knock on the door. "Miss Mary," came the voice of a woman she didn't recognize, but whose presence felt almost too familiar. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard what happened with Officer Roberts yesterday. I had to speak with you." Mary opened the door, her gaze sharp but calm. The woman standing there was younger than her, probably in her 30s, with a worried expression painted across her face. She looked around nervously before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "What's your name?" Mary asked, not unkindly, but with a hint of caution. "Angela," the woman replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Angela Morris. I live just a few streets away. I'm not sure where to start. Miss Mary, I've been following everything that's been happening in this neighborhood, and, well, what happened yesterday shook me." Mary motioned for her to sit down. "It's been a hard day for all of us. You're not the only one shaken by it." Angela hesitated before sitting, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. She fiddled with her hands, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her blouse. "I know this may sound strange, but I've been watching how the people in this neighborhood are reacting to everything, and I've noticed something." Angela began, her voice growing quieter as if she feared someone might overhear. "There's a change, a shift in how people are looking at you, Miss Mary, like they're waiting for you to take some kind of stand. They think you're the one who can do something about all of this." Mary's heart skipped a beat, though she didn't let it show. "What are you talking about?" Angela looked up, meeting Mary's eyes with a mixture of fear and hope. "People are looking to you for leadership. After what happened with the officer, after what happened with the dog, people are starting to believe that you can help us. You've seen everything. You've fought this fight for so long. You're the one they think can bring change." Mary sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had spent so many years fighting, so many years trying to make a difference, but she had never thought of herself as a leader, not in the way Angela was suggesting. "I don't know if I can be that person, Angela," she said softly. "I'm just one woman, one old woman with more years behind me than ahead of me." Angela's expression softened, but there was a fierceness in her eyes that Mary hadn't expected. "But you're the one who knows. You've seen how the system works, how they break people down. You've survived it, and that's what we need now. Someone who understands the fight, someone who can help us organize, push back." Mary's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was weighing her words carefully. "I've lived through too many battles, too many broken promises. You want me to lead, to risk everything again?" "Yes," Angela said, her voice steady, "because we need you. This neighborhood needs you. The world needs you to show us that it's possible to change things." The weight of her words hit Mary like a freight train. She had known for a long time that the fight wasn't over, but to have someone place this kind of hope in her, it was overwhelming. Mary felt the heavy burden of history pressing down on her. She had fought for justice before, for the rights of her people, for the future of her children and grandchildren. But now, as an older woman, the fight seemed more personal. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone she loved. "I don't know if I can," Mary said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'll try. I'll try for all of us." Angela smiled, a look of relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Miss Mary. That's all we need. Just a chance." The days after Mary's conversation with Angela passed in a blur, the weight of her decision settling deeper into her soul. Each morning, she woke to the same silence, the same heavy atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything around her. The neighborhood, once full of life and activity, had taken on a somber tone. People walked the streets with their heads down, their eyes avoiding one another. But Mary knew that something was changing, something was stirring beneath the surface. She couldn't explain it, but it was there, a quiet but undeniable force that was pushing its way into the open. And for the first time in years, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. She sat on her porch, as she often did in the early mornings, watching the world slowly wake up. The birds sang their usual songs, and the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the street. But even in the peace of the dawn, Mary could feel the storm coming. It wasn't a literal storm, no. This was something more dangerous. It was the storm of change, the storm of people realizing that they had been given a voice, a chance to fight back. The knock on her door came just as she was contemplating the weight of the world. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. "Miss Mary," Angela's voice sounded strained, almost urgent. "We need to talk." Mary stepped aside to let her in, already anticipating the conversation that was about to unfold. Angela's eyes were wide, her expression tense. "What happened?" Mary asked, already sensing that something had shifted. Angela didn't sit down. She paced the floor, her hands wringing together in nervous energy. "It's happening faster than I thought," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "People are starting to gather. They're starting to organize. They're looking to you, Miss Mary. They're waiting for you to lead them." Mary nodded, but there was no surprise in her reaction. She had expected this. It had been inevitable. I never asked for this, she said quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. I know, Angela replied, but sometimes, the thing we never ask for is the thing that's needed most. They trust you. They believe in you. The words echoed in Mary's mind. They trust you. They believe in you. She had heard those words before, but never with such intensity, never with such urgency. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of something bigger than herself, a movement that was gathering momentum every second. I don't know if I can do this, Mary said, her voice soft but firm. I'm too old. I've lived through too much. I've seen too many people fail. Angela stopped pacing and looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and understanding. You're not alone in this. We're all here with you. We'll help you. Mary took a deep breath and looked out the window. The world outside seemed so unchanged, so still, but she knew the truth. The world was shifting, whether she was ready for it or not. The people were ready to rise, to fight for what they knew was right. They just needed someone to show them how. I'll do it, Mary said, her voice gaining strength. I'll lead them, but we do this together. No one is left behind. Angela's eyes softened with gratitude, and she nodded. We're with you, Miss Mary, always. The next few days were a whirlwind. Word spread fast through the neighborhood, faster than Mary had anticipated. What had started as a small gathering of concerned citizens quickly grew into something larger, something more powerful. People from different walks of life, from different corners of the city, came together in a quiet solidarity that surprised even Mary. She had always known that the strength of the people was their unity, but seeing it unfold before her eyes was a humbling experience. Her porch became a makeshift headquarters, a place where discussions and plans were made, a place where the weight of responsibility seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Angela was there almost every day, working alongside Mary to organize the masses, to give them direction. The meetings were intense, filled with emotion and passion. Each person brought their own story, their own pain, and their own hope. And Mary, for the first time in years, felt like she was part of something greater than herself. But there was always an underlying tension. The police were watching, the higher-ups in the city were watching, and they didn't like what they saw. Mary could feel it in the way the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. The tension was palpable. People began to whisper about what might come next. The officers who had once turned a blind eye were now paying attention. They didn't like the idea of the community uniting. They didn't like the idea of people standing up for their rights. Mary knew that danger was close. She had seen it too many times before. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had a purpose. She had people who depended on her. As the days turned into weeks, the meetings grew larger. The conversations became more focused. Plans for protests, for organizing against the injustices in their community, were laid out. Mary wasn't just leading a fight against police brutality anymore. She was leading a fight for dignity, for respect, for equality. It was a fight that Mary had been born into. It was a fight that had been passed down to her by the generations before her. And now, she was the one carrying that torch. The tension reached its peak when the first protest was announced. It was scheduled to take place in the heart of the city, a direct challenge to the authorities that had long turned a blind eye to the suffering of people like Mary and her neighbors. The organizers, led by Mary and Angela, had made sure the protest was peaceful, no violence, no destruction, but they knew that the authorities would be looking for any excuse to crack down on them. The day of the protest arrived, and Mary stood in front of a large crowd that had gathered in the central square. People from every walk of life stood together, their faces filled with determination. There were old women like Mary, young men like Daniel, and children, too, who had come to see what it meant to stand up for what was right. The air was thick with anticipation, and Mary could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped up to the front of the crowd, Angela by her side, and raised her hand to signal for silence. The crowd fell quiet, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. "We are here today because we believe in justice," Mary said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We are here because we refuse to be silenced. We refuse to be treated as less than human. Our voices matter, our lives matter, and we will not stop until we are heard." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound of their collective hope and rage filling the air. It was a moment of power, of unity, of defiance. But just as the rally began to pick up momentum, the police arrived. They came in force, a wall of riot gear and armored vehicles. The heavy presence of law enforcement meant to intimidate and control. Mary's heart sank as she watched them line up, their faces hidden behind shields and helmets. They were ready for confrontation. Mary had known this moment was coming, but seeing it unfold before her eyes, the raw power of the state arrayed against them, was a sobering sight. She turned to Angela, who was standing beside her, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay calm," Mary whispered, her voice calm despite the rising tension. "This is what we've been preparing for." The first chants began, a low murmur that quickly grew louder as the crowd began to push forward, their voices uniting in a single demand for justice. The police responded, pushing back, the tension escalating with every passing second. Mary stood firm, her eyes locked on the officers. She knew this was only the beginning, but no matter what happened, she wouldn't back down. This fight had to be fought, it had to be won. The scene at the protest escalated quickly, the chanting grew louder, more powerful, the voices of the crowd reverberating through the city streets. But the police, determined to show their authority, began to push forward, blocking the path of the protesters with their heavy shields. The air was thick with the tension of what was to come. Mary stood at the front of the crowd, her heart racing but her mind clear. She could feel the heat of the moment, the weight of the eyes on her, on all of them. She could hear the voices of the people around her, their anger, their fear, their hope. They were here for something bigger than themselves, bigger than any one person. They were here for justice, and they were willing to stand their ground. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Angela, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "Miss Mary, we need to move back," Angela said urgently. "The police are getting ready to charge." But Mary didn't move. She couldn't, not now. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would determine whether all their work, all their sacrifice, would mean anything. The people needed to see her strength. They needed to see that she would not back down, that she would not let fear dictate their actions. "No," Mary said firmly, shaking her head. "We stand our ground. We don't move. This is our time." Just then, a flash of movement caught her eye. The first line of police officers began to march forward, their shields raised, their batons ready. The crowd tensed, every person bracing for what would come next. The officers shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the noise of the crowd. The protesters surged forward, not with violence, but with an undeniable force of will. And then it happened. A shot rang out. The deafening sound of a gunshot shattered the air, and in an instant, the chaos erupted. The protesters screamed, ducking for cover. As the police advanced, Mary's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. They had fired into the crowd. They had opened fire. Panic spread like wildfire. The crowd scattered, some running, others trying to help those who had fallen. Mary's knees weakened, but she stood tall. She could feel the weight of the responsibility, the burden of leadership, pressing down on her. She had to act. "Stay together," Mary shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't let them break us. Stay strong." The protest had turned into a nightmare. What had started as a peaceful demonstration for justice had now become a scene of violence and destruction. The police were everywhere, their presence overwhelming. Mary could see people being dragged away, others being thrown to the ground. It was all happening too fast. But through the chaos, Mary found a moment of clarity. She turned to Angela, who was standing beside her, her face filled with terror. "We have to get out of here," Angela said, panic in her voice. "No," Mary said, shaking her head again. "We stay. We keep fighting. We won't let them win." As she spoke those words, the realization hit her. This was more than just a protest. This was the beginning of something much larger. It was a movement that couldn't be stopped. No matter how many lives were lost, no matter how much blood was spilled, they had awakened something inside the people, something that couldn't be extinguished. The gunshot echoed in Mary's mind. She knew that things would never be the same. They had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The days following the protest were a blur of broken glass, shattered hopes, and mounting grief. Mary couldn't remember the last time she had slept or eaten properly. The adrenaline had carried her through the worst of the chaos. But now, the weight of what had happened was starting to sink in. The police were everywhere. The media coverage was relentless, each station showing the same footage of the violence, of the tear gas, of the gunshots fired into the crowd. Mary saw the faces of the fallen, the protesters who had lost their lives, and the anger inside her boiled over. This was no longer just about one injustice. It was about everything that had been wrong in their community for years, everything that had been ignored, overlooked, or erased. She had to act, but the city was divided. Some people supported the protesters, others saw them as a threat. The police were tightening their grip, and the local government was scrambling to regain control of the situation. It felt like the entire city was on the edge of a knife, teetering between hope and despair. Mary knew that the road ahead would be long. It would take more than just one protest. more than just one act of resistance, to bring about change. But this moment, this defining moment, had ignited something within the people. They had tasted what it meant to stand up for themselves, to demand justice, and they wouldn't go back. She met with Angela and the other leaders in the movement. They needed a plan, a way to channel the outrage, to keep the fire burning. The protests weren't over, they had only just begun. But even as they made their plans, Mary couldn't escape the haunting memories of that day. The gunshot, the screams, the blood, the faces of those who had fallen. She sat alone that night, in the same place where it had all started. The porch was quiet now, the streetlights flickering as they cast shadows on the pavement. Mary felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had known that this fight would be hard, but the cost had been higher than she could have imagined. But one thing had become clear to her: they couldn't stop now. They couldn't afford to, not after everything they had lost. It was a cold morning when the call came in. The city was on the brink of total unrest. What had started as a series of protests had now become a full-scale movement. People were in the streets, not just in their neighborhood, but all over the city, demanding justice, equality, and an end to the violence. They had found their voice, and they were not about to let it be silenced. Mary and Angela stood together, watching as the first wave of protesters began to march down the street. It was a sight that filled Mary with both hope and dread. This was the moment of truth. This would either be the end of the movement, or the beginning of something greater. As they reached the city center, the police were already there, prepared for whatever might come next. The air was thick with tension, the sound of helicopters overhead adding to the sense of impending danger. Mary stood at the front of the crowd once again, her hand raised. She was ready to speak. She had to. This was her chance to unite them all, to bring them together for the final stand. "My friends," Mary began, her voice ringing out clear and strong, "we stand here today not just for ourselves, but for the generations that came before us, for the generations that will come after us. We stand here for justice, for equality, and for the right to live without fear." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy palpable, their resolve unshakable. Mary turned to Angela, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it," she whispered. "We're not going back." As the first tear gas canisters were thrown into the crowd, Mary held her ground. She could see the fear in the eyes of the people around her, but she could also see something else, the fire of defiance. The final stand had begun.